Hi everyone, and welcome back to GISC 126, Fundamentals of GIS. So in the last video lecture, I presented the vector data model, which is used for discrete data. Today, we'll take a look at the raster data model, which is suited for continuous data. So what is the raster data model? A representation of the world as a surface divided into a regular grid of cells. Raster models are useful for storing data that varies continuously in space, as in aerial photography, a satellite image, a surface of chemical concentrations, or elevation surfaces. In this simplest form, a raster consists of a matrix of cells, also called pixels, and they're organized into rows and columns, which are referred to as a grid, which each cell contains a value representing information, such as a temperature. So here we have a slide of an image of elevation. So at this scale, we can look at it, we can see the lighter blue, not including the ocean there, the dark blue, with the lighter blue, lower elevation, and it's kind of progressively getting higher and higher elevation up to the white in the mountains. So if we click on this and we keep going, we can see as we zoom in, we can see a little bit more grainy until we kind of can zoom far, far in, just like you would imagine if you had a picture on your phone. You can zoom in, it gets very grainy, it gets pixelated. And in this example here, we have a cell. And there's many cells we can see, and this one that's outlined in black is an area on the ground, and that elevation is 136 meters. So this is a data model, and a data model is just organized into a bunch of cells that are comprised of a grid. So as I said, a raster is simply a grid of columns and rows where each row has a value associated with it. So in this example, row 2, column 3 has an assigned numerical value. We can then assign a color to that numerical value so we can more easily interpret the spatial pattern. So to help us better understand the raster data model, let's start with a simplified vector data model. So in this vector model, we have pink point that represents a tree, a blue line that represents a stream, and a green polygon that represents a park. In vector data, this data can be quite accurate in terms of its location on the Earth's surface. So now let's look at how this vector data model is viewed as a raster data model. Since the raster data model is comprised of a continuous surface of cells, we can place this imaginary grid over our vector model. So this is only kind of for illustrative purposes. In real life, we're not placing a grid over anything, but this is just a way of visualizing this. So we'll discuss the cell size later in the lecture. But now we can see that the features occupy portions of each cell or the entirety of a cell. So notice how we can then color the cell based on the feature it contains within the cell. So for example, our pink tree that was once a point is now represented as a pink square. Same goes for the river and parks. But let's go back to the river. Notice that the three cells have just a tiny portion of the river going through the cell. So this is referred to as a mixed pixel problem. And so the question arises, should the cell be given the value of the river or not? So there are several methods for determining this, such as the centroid method, which would assign to each cell the value of the feature that passes through the center of the cell. Another one is the winner-take-all, where the majority of the feature running through the cell, just to name a few. So this mixed pixel problem is something that you will not encounter in this course, or you won't need to deal with it, but it's something that you should be aware of. So here's our raster data model that models our trees, streams, and parks. So which model do you think more accurately represents the real world? The vector data model or the raster data model? So in this example, I would say the vector data model does a better job because the raster model is very precise. So thin streams are now much more generalized in its location in this raster data model. Same for parks. So how can we reduce some of this generalization? How can we make our raster model maybe more accurate and more true to what is really occurring on the ground? But first, let's take a quick look at cell size again. So here is this image, and we have a raster data showing elevation. The colors, as I said before, denotes the elevation value. So for example, again, the light blue by the ocean is lower elevation and it increases as we go towards the darker. So as we zoom in, we notice that the raster is comprised of cells, which we saw previously, just like in a photo. And if we keep zooming in further, we can clearly see the individual cells, which represent an elevation number, but coded as a color for easy interpretation by the user. So here we can see that each cell size is 30 meters by 30 meters. So this means in this elevation model that we looked at, we just zoomed in, each square is 30 meters by 30 meters on the Earth's surface. So each cell size is 30 by 30. You can't have any varying cell sizes within a single raster model. So for example, you can't have one cell size being 30 by 30 meter, another one 10 by 10 meter, and so forth. If you're going to have one raster file, it has to be all the same spatial resolution, same cell size. So the level of detail of the feature phenomena is dependent on the cell size, right? So why not make the cell size very small, say a meter? So instead of mapping the Earth's surface, for example, as a grid of 30 by 30 meters, why don't we do 1 meter by 1 meter? That's going to be a much smaller area on the Earth's surface, and so you're going to be able to distinguish between features much more accurately. So why don't we do this? So here are 3 raster images of varying cell size, or referred to as kind of resolution. So as you can see clearly, the 3 meter resolution is much finer in detail than the 30 meter. The 3 meter, we can see great detail, where the 30 meter is a little fuzzy, 10 meter is a little better, but 3 meter is the best of these 3 options here. This is because the cell size is only 3 meter by 3 meter, so the features on the surface of the Earth can be more accurately defined. So get back to the question, why not always collect our raster data in the smallest resolution possible, such as 1 meter, for example? There are quite a few reasons why you would not want to do this. One of the biggest reasons is cost. It can be quite costly to acquire raster data at a finer resolution and be out of a budget for many organizations, so it's just not possible to do. Second is the file size, which can get very large with fine resolution. Very larger file sizes are harder to work with, harder to share, take up more storage space, etc. Finally, the project scope will often dictate what resolution of data is required. For example, if you work for Ada County in the GIS department and you need aerial imagery of the county, you would probably not need 1 meter resolution for rural or forested areas, but you would like this level of detail for urban areas. So as you kind of deal with your data, your needs might be different, and always the finer the detail isn't always necessary. So why store data as a raster? Sometimes you don't have the choice of storing your data as a raster. For example, imagery is always available as raster. However, there are many other features such as points and measurements such as rainfall that could be stored as either a raster or as a vector data file type. So the advantage of storing your data as a raster it's a simple structure. It's a matrix of cells with values representing a coordinate and sometimes linked to an attribute table. It's a powerful format for advanced spatial and statistical analysis. the ability to represent continuous surface and perform surface analysis, the ability to uniformly store points, lines, and polygons in surfaces, also the ability to perform fast overlays with complex data sets. There are other considerations for storing your data as a raster that may convince you to use vector data models. For example, there could be spatial inaccuracies due to the limits imposed by the raster dataset's cell dimensions. And raster datasets are potentially very large. Resolutions increase as the size of the cell increases. So the disadvantages, as I mentioned before, large datasets, sizes, cartographic limitations, and as I said, inherent spatial inaccuracies due to cell size-based representations. So this is the raster data model, which is just a cell-based model composed of a grid.